"Look at this useless old man," shouted Alejandro Montalban, raising his champagne glass and pointing at the elderly waiter. The entire room turned to Don Esteban Ramirez, who trembled with the tray in his hands. "A luxury hotel, and they serve us a decrepit deaf man. Do you understand anything, or are you just pretending?" Laughter echoed like sharp blades, cutting through the air. Don Esteban tried to maintain his composure, but his hesitant steps nearly caused a glass to fall. The tycoon didn't miss the opportunity. "See? He can't even walk properly. Maybe he escaped the asylum and infiltrated here to steal our leftovers." The audience erupted in laughter, like hyenas surrounding fragile prey. "Old man, tell me, can you even speak English?" Alejandro teased, feigning seriousness. "Or is your head just full of dust? Let's do a test. If you repeat what I say, I'll give you a tip. But if you get it wrong, you wipe the floor with your tongue." The guests applauded the cruelty, eager for the spectacle. Don Esteban opened his mouth, but hesitated. The prolonged silence was the fuel Alejandro needed. "Look, he can't even open his mouth without choking. A perfect portrait of human failure." With each word, more laughter erupted, sinking the old man into shame. Some guests began recording the scene on their cell phones, reveling in the humiliation. The elderly man turned his back, trying to leave discreetly, but Alejandro grabbed his arm. No, it's not over yet. You're going to entertain my friends, since you're no good at serving." Lucia, the tycoon's daughter, tried to intervene. "Father, please, this is inhumane." But Alejandro silenced her with a harsh gesture. "Shut up, Lucia. This old man is nothing but dead weight who has survived longer than he should." The entire room applauded, complicit in the evil. Don Esteban gripped the tray so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His body trembled, but there was something different in his eyes, not just shame, but also a hidden flame beginning to awaken. Alejandro, intoxicated by his own arrogance, raised his voice. "If this old man can answer me in French, I'll give him the equivalent of a year's salary. Otherwise, leave here on your knees and thank me for letting you live." The audience cheered at the bet. Silence fell over the room. Don Esteban took a deep breath, placed the tray on the nearest table, and slowly raised his head. His steady eyes met Alejandro's for the first time that night. The tycoon laughed, certain of his victory. "Come on, old man. Show everyone how pathetic you are. Say something, anything, before your mouth rots in silence." The audience awaited the waiter's final downfall, unaware that the night held another truth. The entire room was in suspense. All eyes were on Don Esteban, waiting for the final humiliation. Alejandro, with a mocking smile, made a gesture of triumph, believing he had already won this cruel game. The old man, however, lifted his face with unexpected calm. His eyes no longer trembled. With a firm voice and perfect pronunciation, he replied in French, "Monsieur Montalban, dignity is not measured in gold, and humiliation always returns to those who sow it." The hall froze. The laughter immediately ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. Some guests widened their eyes, in disbelief at what they had just heard. Alejandro, confused, tried to laugh. "He memorized some phrase, nothing more. Let's see if you know more than that." But his voice no longer held the same strength. The tycoon's confidence was beginning to crumble. Don Esteban continued, now in impeccable English. "Sir, I have translated words that shape nations. Your arrogance means nothing to me." Each syllable resonated like a blow to the host's pride. Murmurs filled the audience. Some older guests recalled historical treatises and began to suspect the identity of the humiliated waiter. The discomfort grew with each passing moment. Lucia smiled discreetly, proud of the old man's courage. Her eyes met his, conveying respect and silent support. For the first time that night, someone looked at Don Esteban without contempt. Alejandro, feeling challenged, approached and shouted, "Who do you think you are, old man? A beggar disguised as a wise man?" But the insecurity in his voice was evident, and the audience was beginning to notice. Don Esteban straightened his posture and faced the magnate calmly. I'm just a man who's lived long enough to know that the truth always finds its voice. His calm was a crushing contrast to Alejandro's fury. The hall remained deathly silent. The planned humiliation had backfired on the host himself. And everyone knew. This was just the first revelation of a night that would change destinies. The hall remained suspended in a heavy silence, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. Everyone was shocked by Don Esteban's sudden revelation, speaking languages perfectly while minutes before he had been ridiculed as a useless person. Alejandro tried to maintain a mocking smile, but his eyes trembled with the insecurity of someone who, for the first time, had seen his authority questioned in front of the crowd. Some guests began to whisper, recognizing historical phrases the elderly man had quoted. They recalled important political moments and wondered how a simple waiter could know such specific details. Others, still accomplices of the tycoon, tried to laugh, but the sound was forced and clashed with the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere. Lucia, her heart racing, watched Don Esteban with growing admiration. She knew this man was unusual. There was something profound in his demeanor. His silence until then wasn't one of fear, but of anticipation. It was as if he'd calculated the exact moment to speak, transforming the humiliation into a surefire blow to his father's arrogance. Alejandro, trying to regain control, raised his glass and shouted, "Cheap tricks! Anyone can memorize phrases in different languages. He's nothing but a miserable charlatan trying to win pity with circus tricks." But his voice sounded weaker than before, as if he didn't even believe what he was saying. Don Esteban looked around calmly. His eyes roamed every face until they finally settled on Alejandro. "These are no tricks, Mr. Montalban. I've spent my life translating voices that have changed the history of this world. You sign contracts and exchange wealth here, but I was present when wars, treaties, and the fate of entire peoples were decided." His words fell like hammers upon the silence. The audience, now divided, began to fidget. Some backed away, unsure how to react, while others kept their eyes fixed on the elderly man, thirsty for more answers. It was as if the party had suddenly lost its luster, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable curiosity. Alejandro tried to laugh, but his laughter was clipped and weak. "Crazy, old man. You want us to believe you've stood alongside kings and presidents? How ridiculous." He tried to draw applause, but the audience no longer responded as they had before. The atmosphere had changed, and the power of Alejandro's voice was fading. Don Esteban simply straightened his back, keeping his gaze steady. "It's ridiculous to believe that a man's worth lies in the weight of his wallet. I've been to places where your fortune would have meant nothing, because what was at stake there was the lives of millions. And I, alone, carried words that could save or destroy nations." The silence in the hall deepened even further. Now it wasn't just discomfort, but the feeling that something grand was about to be revealed. It was as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something they would never forget. Lucia took a deep breath, deciding not to remain passive any longer. She approached her father and said in a clear voice, "Father, enough is enough. Perhaps we should listen to what this man has to say. Ridiculing him only shames us further." The entire room held its breath at the young woman's courage. Alejandro, overcome with wounded pride, clenched his fist silently. He knew that if he lost the battle against that old man in front of his own daughter and the entire elite, his social power would be shaken. But the more he tried to control the situation, the more he realized the night no longer belonged to him. Don Esteban took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, as if revisiting long-held memories. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but charged with a historical weight that the entire hall could feel. "I remember Geneva, 1978. I was there, among ministers and generals, when every word could be the start of a war or the relief of an entire people. I translated the silence they couldn't read. The guests looked at each other in shock. The mention of dates and events was neither vague nor generic, but detailed, impossible to have been made up by chance. Some older guests remembered the treaties mentioned well and were beginning to believe that this man had truly been behind the scenes of world power. Alejandro tried to cut through the moment, laughing loudly and clapping. "Bravo! A fabulous actor. He should be in the theater, not serving drinks. Does anyone really believe this fairy tale?" But as he looked around, he realized his audience was no longer laughing with him. Their looks were filled with doubt, respect, and even admiration for the elderly man. Lucia stepped forward, staring her father down. "Perhaps the question isn't whether we believe him, but why you're so afraid we will." Her firm voice echoed in the room, eliciting murmurs and even more curious glances toward the old waiter. Don Esteban gave a serene smile and continued, this time in another language. In Russian, he recalled passages from tense meetings, describing details few outside those circles had ever known. His gestures were precise, his memory clear as a river flowing again after years of being dammed. The silence in the room was now reverent. Many of the guests, previously complicit in the cruelty, felt small before this simple man who, hidden beneath his waiter's uniform, carried a past of greatness that surpassed any present fortune. Alejandro, sweating, tried to drown out the scene by ordering louder music and more drinks for his guests. But no one moved. Not even the musicians dared play, as if the entire room was mesmerized by the revelation unfolding before their eyes. Don Esteban then slowly approached Alejandro, unafraid. "You called me useless. You said my mouth was good for nothing but choking. But know that it has carried the weight of words that saved millions. And every time you laugh at me, it's not me you humiliate, but the memory of all those who depended on the truth." The words were like knives to Alejandro's mask of arrogance. His posture faltered, and the guests saw, for the first time, the tycoon losing ground to a man he believed inferior. Lucia smiled discreetly, sensing her father's pride cracking in the face of Don Esteban's unshakable truth. The lavish party, which had begun as a spectacle of ostentation, was turning into a silent trial, a trial in which Alejandro was already being condemned. The old man took a deep breath, scanning every face around him. "I've spent my life listening to the powerful. Today it's your turn to hear the voice of those who have been silenced." The entire hall remained silent, absorbing each word as if it were a blow to their collective arrogance. Alejandro, overcome with rage, slammed his glass down on the table, spilling champagne across the gleaming floor. His voice echoed with desperation, trying to regain the attention he no longer had. "Don't you see? He's just a decadent old man, making up stories to steal our pity." But the sound of his words no longer resonated. The audience watched him with cold eyes, weighing his arrogance against Don Esteban's serenity. The elderly man remained motionless, like a statue of dignity amidst the storm. His hands, which had previously trembled while carrying a tray, now rested firmly at his sides. His silence was more eloquent than any defense. It was proof that those who guard the truth need not shout, for its strength asserts itself. Lucia took another step forward, crossing her arms firmly. "Father, the more you try to belittle him, the smaller you become before us all." Her words were met with murmurs of approval among some guests, who no longer bothered to hide their contempt for the tycoon's behavior. Alejandro glared at his own daughter, unable to believe she would dare confront him in front of her peers. But her reaction only reinforced the feeling that he was losing control. The tycoon, who had always commanded with gestures and shouts, now found himself surrounded by gazes that questioned his authority. Don Esteban broke the silence, and in a firm voice declared, "Mr. Montalban, the power you believe you possess is nothing more than an illusion. The respect you think you command is based on fear, and fear is as fragile as glass. Once broken, only emptiness remains." The impact of his words pierced the room like an invisible blade. Some younger guests, who had previously laughed at the cruelty, lowered their heads in shame. Others, older, recalled times when they had also underestimated humble people, and now saw the reflection of their own mistakes. The party was no longer a spectacle of luxury, but a tribunal of conscience. Alejandro, unable to bear the humiliation, took a step toward Don Esteban. His face was flushed, the veins on his neck bulged, and every movement betrayed the fury of a man seeing his mask ripped off. "You dare defy me in my own home?" he shouted, trying to assert his authority. Don Esteban didn't back down. His eyes were two burning coals, reflecting a courage no luxury could buy. "I don't challenge you, sir. I'm simply showing you that your house was built on sand. And when the tide of truth rises, even palaces crumble." The audience held their breath, gripped by the weight of that metaphor. Lucia moved even closer to the old man and placed her hand on his shoulder, as if sealing a silent alliance. The simple scene had a devastating effect on Alejandro, who felt his own daughter choosing to stand by the man he was trying to destroy. The silence that followed was deafening. The tycoon, who had so loved the attention, was now watched like a defendant on trial. Every glance cast upon him was no longer one of admiration, but of condemnation. The weight of the truth crushed him before the very people who had once applauded him. Don Esteban took a deep breath and raised his voice clearly. "Humiliating is easy for those who have never had to prove their own worth. But remember, every word hurled at the humble is like a stone thrown into the sky. One day it always comes crashing back down." The hall remained paralyzed, absorbing each syllable like a final verdict. Don Esteban closed his eyes for a moment and immersed himself in the memories that time had tried to erase. When he spoke again, his voice carried vivid images that transported those present to places few had imagined. "I was in Berlin when the walls fell and the whole world breathed a sigh of relief. I translated tears into words, fears into promises, and no one ever knew my name, because glory was never my goal." The audience listened like disciples before a master. Their eyes were fixed on the elderly man, and even the younger waiters had stopped working to listen to him. It was as if the hall had been transformed into a makeshift classroom, where the lessons came not from expensive books, but from the mouth of a man who carried history alive in his memory. Alejandro tried to interrupt, but his voice was drowned out by an unexpected request from one of the most influential guests. "Let him speak," said a retired diplomat, his eyes welling up. "I've been to some of those conferences, and I remember him. He speaks the truth." The revelation fell like a sentence, validating every word Don Esteban had said. The audience erupted in murmurs of astonishment. The old waiter was no longer seen as an unknown, but as a living witness to history. Each detail revealed was like a brick knocking down the wall of arrogance Alejandro had built around himself. Don Esteban continued now in Spanish, so everyone could understand without barriers. "I worked in silence because I knew I needed to be unseen for peace to be achieved. But today, here, I don't speak for myself. I speak for all those who have been forgotten, humiliated, and discarded by the arrogance of a few." Lucia discreetly wiped away a tear that ran down her cheek. She felt proud to be standing before a man who didn't need fortune to be great. She also realized the gulf that separated Don Esteban's character from his father's arrogance. Alejandro, now surrounded by the guests' disbelief, tried to compose himself, but his words sounded hollow, lacking authority. "This is nothing but cheap theater. He invents memories to seduce you. He's an imposter." However, his voice no longer held power and sounded more like the lament of someone cornered. Don Esteban held his head firmly and replied calmly, "If I'm an imposter, how could I explain that the men here have already recognized me? How could I invent what I experienced in the flesh, risking my own life for the future of all of you?" The hall fell into absolute silence, confirming the weight of his words. A younger guest moved, stood, and applauded. Soon, others followed suit, creating a stark contrast. While Alejandro wilted under the disapproving looks, Don Esteban received for the first time in decades the respect he had been denied for so long. The old man smiled, but not with vanity. His smile was one of relief, like someone finally freeing the truth from an invisible prison. And in that instant, everyone realized the humiliation that had begun as a cruel spectacle had transformed into an unforgettable lesson in dignity and memory. The luxurious hall no longer held the same luster as before. The laughter that echoed among the glasses and necklaces had turned into an uncomfortable silence, heavy as lead. All eyes were fixed on Don Esteban, and every word that came out of his mouth seemed to carry more value than all the gold that glittered in the room. Alejandro, however, still stood there, restless, with the expression of a cornered man refusing to accept defeat. Lucia moved even closer to the elderly man, as if to protect this fragile figure who, in truth, seemed stronger than everyone present. Her gesture sparked murmurs among the guests, some in awe of her courage, others shocked by the direct affront to their own father. The contrast between the young woman and the magnate perfectly portrayed the conflict that was erupting that night. Alejandro tried to break the tension with sarcasm, but his voice sounded weak. "Don't be fooled, my friends. This man is just a cunning impostor. If he were truly so important, he wouldn't be serving drinks in this room." But as he said this, he realized his arguments were becoming increasingly hollow. The audience no longer applauded him, only watched him suspiciously. Don Esteban, for his part, remained calm. He looked at everyone serenely and declared, "I'm here because I wanted to disappear. My life was marked by betrayals and the hidden agendas of men who never knew the word honor. I was forgotten, but not because I was worthless, but because my silence bothered the powerful." The audience leaned forward, captivated by the narrative. The old man's words swept through the room like currents of cold air. Each sentence revealed not only a hidden past, but also a direct criticism of those present. Many felt as if they were being unmasked in that moment, even though Don Esteban hadn't named any names. Shame spread like wildfire among the guests. Lucia lifted her chin and said in a clear voice, "He doesn't need to prove anything anymore. Everyone here has already felt the truth in his words. Father, the more you try to silence him, the more ridiculous you become." The impact of her words made Alejandro clench his fists, powerless in the face of his own daughter. The tycoon tried to react, taking a step toward the elderly man, but was restrained by the firm gaze of several guests who could no longer tolerate his arrogance. The balance of power, previously tilted entirely in his favor, now swung dangerously toward Don Esteban. It was as if the entire ballroom had changed hands that night. Don Esteban didn't need to raise his voice. He simply continued, "I've spent my life translating truths that few dared to speak. Today, I'm not here to ask for pity, but to remind everyone that dignity cannot be buried. It always finds a way to resurface." His words echoed like a sentence. The guests remained motionless, like spectators of an inevitable judgment. The laughter that had once fueled Alejandro now became a burden against him. Silence was the weapon that slowly destroyed his empire of arrogance. Lucia looked at her father and said, "Perhaps tonight will be remembered not for the party, but for the lesson you tried to prevent. And it will be a lesson that will stay with you forever." Her eyes shone with the conviction of someone who knew she was witnessing the fall of a giant. Alejandro was breathing heavily, as if he were gasping for air. His pride, for years his strength, now turned into a chain dragging him down. In front of everyone, the tycoon was no longer the master of the party, but the defendant in a moral judgment he could not escape. Don Esteban slowly raised his hand, calling for silence, though no one dared interrupt him. His tired face bore the marks of years, but his eyes shone like live coals. "You saw me as a useless servant, a deaf old man destined for oblivion. But know this, even the walls of this hall carry echoes of my voice, for I have been to places where history was written. The murmur that followed was one of pure amazement. The older guests exchanged glances of recognition. Some remembered hearing about an enigmatic translator who had been present at crucial diplomatic meetings, but whose name had never been revealed to the public. It was as if that mystery, hidden for decades, was now being unraveled before their eyes. Alejandro, already out of control, shouted, "Lies! They're just lies! He makes them up to feel important!" But his voice was nothing more than a nervous echo, fragile under the weight of the memories that became indisputable proof in the minds of those present. Every sentence Don Esteban uttered rang like truth engraved in his soul. Lucia stepped forward and stared at her father firmly. "Who here seems to be lying, father? The one who speaks calmly or the man who trembles with fear of losing his mask?" Her voice cut through the air like a blade, and the guests murmured in agreement, pushing Alejandro further back against the wall. Don Esteban continued, his tone even more emotionally charged. Translating wasn't just about words. It was about carrying entire lives on my lips. Every decision depended on the clarity with which I conveyed messages. I carried the fate of nations in my voice, and no one ever applauded me. But no one has ever been able to erase what I experienced. The entire room was captivated. Some guests had tears in their eyes, not only because of the story revealed, but also because of their own shame at having participated in the initial mockery. The moral weight of Don Esteban's words transformed the party into a courtroom where everyone felt like a defendant. Alejandro, now panting, still tried to defend himself. "You're fools for believing him. I'm living proof that money is the power. This old man is just a forgotten remnant of the past." But his words fell on deaf ears. There was no more applause, only looks of contempt. Don Esteban approached Alejandro slowly, his steps firm despite his age. He stopped before him and said with cutting calm, "Power is not humiliating the weak. Power is upholding the truth when everyone else wants to keep quiet. And in this, Señor Montalban, you have always been a small man." The silence was absolute, heavy as stone. Lucia held the old man's hand, sealing the break with her father once and for all. Her simple gesture was like a final sentence against Alejandro, who felt the blow not only of the truth, but of his daughter's own rejection. The crowd watched in silence, increasingly convinced that the tycoon was defeated. Don Esteban then looked up at the entire room. "Tonight is not about me, nor about him. It's about all of you. Laugh if you want, but remember, every time you humiliate someone, you bury a piece of your own humanity. And in the end, that is what will condemn you." The impact of his words pierced every heart present. The room remained motionless, breathing in the gravity of that moment. For the first time, Alejandro had no response, no applause, no shield. The party that began as a luxurious spectacle was transforming into an eternal lesson, and the truth weighed on everyone like a shadow impossible to ignore. Alejandro, red with rage, advanced to the center of the room and raised his arms as if he still had control over the situation. "You've all let yourselves be fooled by an old fraud. I am Alejandro Montalban, the man who built half this city. Without me, you'd have nowhere to celebrate." But instead of applause, his declaration was met with silence and looks of contempt. The audience no longer saw him as a king, but as a naked tyrant before everyone. Don Esteban remained serene, his humble demeanor transformed into a symbol of dignity. He built buildings, yes, but he forgot that you can't build respect with bricks. What you see as glory is nothing but empty concrete. What I built were bridges between peoples. And bridges, Mr. Montalban, don't crumble with time. The contrast between their statements was devastating. Lucia, her voice firm, turned to the guests. "My father always believed that money gave him the right to humiliate whomever he wanted. But today, everyone here can see that he is just a small man hiding behind numbers, while this old man, whom he tried to ridicule, carries within himself true greatness. The audience reacted with murmurs of agreement, increasing Alejandro's embarrassment. Desperate, the tycoon pointed at Don Esteban and shouted, "Don't you realize? He's a nobody! No one remembers his name! No one recognizes him!" But at the same moment, the retired diplomat stood up again and declared firmly, "I remember. I was there." And this man translated the words that prevented thousands of deaths. The world may have forgotten his name, but I never will. The revelation was like a public slap in the face. The guests burst into louder murmurs, some even in timid applause. Alejandro tried to shout over them, but his voice was drowned out by the wave of disapproval now rising against him. With each attempt to assert himself, he became more ridiculous. His arrogance, once feared, was now a source of collective shame. Don Esteban looked at him calmly, and in a deep voice said, "They have forgotten my name because I did not seek fame, but they will remember yours, Señor Montalban, as they remember all those they chose to humiliate. Your legacy will be one of shame, and no marble building can hide that." The words echoed like an irrevocable sentence. Alejandro tried to laugh, but the sound that came out of his mouth was more of a nervous sob than a laugh. His mask of power was shattered. The audience, once his ally, was now his prison, and every glance cast an invisible stone of judgment upon him. Lucia raised her voice again. "Father, you always told me our family was respected. But today, I see that respect was never in you. It's here, before us, in a man you tried to destroy." The tears in her eyes were of indignation and liberation. Alejandro tried to grab the glass to regain his composure, but spilled the liquid on his expensive clothing, provoking muffled laughter from some of the guests. The irony was cruel. The man who had always ridiculed others was now the butt of laughter, not for his poverty, but for his empty arrogance. Don Esteban didn't need to say anything at that moment. The old man's silence was more deafening than any scream. And in that silence, everyone understood. Alejandro's party was over, and what remained was only the portrait of a man stripped of his false grandeur. The tycoon felt the weight of humiliation like never before. He was naked before the truth, powerless, without applause, without allies. And for the first time in his life, he experienced the bitter taste of being inferior to everyone around him. Alejandro, in desperation, tried to approach the old man and shoved him by the shoulder, hoping he would fall and become a laughingstock again. But Don Esteban remained firm, immobile as a rock. The violent gesture did not elicit support. Instead, it drew a chorus of disapproval from the audience, which now rose up against the magnate with indignation. One of the most influential guests, a respected judge, stood up and pointed his finger at Alejandro. "Enough. What we've witnessed here is not just cruel humiliation, but the revelation of the true character of a man who hides behind money. Today we all see who Alejandro Montalban really is." The accusation fell like a gavel. Lucia, unafraid, placed herself between her father and the elderly man. "If you touch him again, father, you'll touch me too. And I won't stay quiet." Her voice trembled, but it was as firm as steel. The guests burst into murmurs of support, and some even applauded her courage. Alejandro, isolated, no longer found an echo for his arrogance. Don Esteban finally raised his voice again. "You wanted to make me dance like a buffoon in front of everyone. You wanted to turn me into a spectacle. But look, Mr. Montalban, now it's you who's dancing, and the music is the music of truth, and there's no way to silence it." The audience reacted with expressions of astonishment, for the humiliation had now been completely reversed. Alejandro, sweating in despair, tried to call his security guards, but none of them moved. The tycoon's power was crumbling before everyone's eyes, and even those paid to protect him no longer saw authority in his voice. The order that had once been law was now nothing more than an empty shout. The old man then stepped forward, staring him down. Humiliating others is easy when you have the money to buy applause. What's difficult is facing the silence that comes when the truth is revealed. This silence you feel now, Mr. Montalban, is the weight of the judgment you will never forget. The guests murmured. Some even chuckled quietly at the tycoon who had always made them bow down. Alejandro squirmed, trying to regain his pride, but each movement was just another step toward his downfall. His image of power was being dismantled before everyone's eyes, brick by brick. Lucia, with tears in her eyes, looked at her father and said, "From today on, I no longer carry your name with pride. I carry it with shame. Because the true legacy of this night will not be your celebration, but your ruin." Her daughter's words were the final stab in the tycoon's reputation. Alejandro tried to shout, but his voice faltered. The guests backed away from him as if his presence were a burden. He was alone, naked before everyone, without allies, without respect, without defense. All that remained was the heavy silence of his defeat. Don Esteban took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and raised his head with dignity. He didn't need to say anything else. The trial was over, and everyone knew who had won that night. Not the tycoon dressed in gold, but the old man dressed in silence and truth. The party that was supposed to celebrate power and luxury ended in ruins. And in the center of the room, Alejandro Montalban experienced the deepest humiliation of his life, while Don Esteban made it clear that true greatness never dies, even when they try to bury it. Alejandro, now breathing heavily, looked around for any remaining allies. But the guests avoided him as if he were a ghost of shame. Those who had previously laughed at his jokes now looked at him with disdain, as if finally seeing the small man hidden behind the glitter of the glasses and gold. Don Esteban remained standing, firm as a mountain before the storm. His frail figure no longer seemed frail. It was as if the silence that had once diminished him was now his greatest weapon. And in that silence, Alejandro felt himself becoming smaller and smaller, crushed by an invisible tribunal that condemned him without words. Lucia never took her eyes off her father. You always believed you could buy respect. But what do you have now? Nothing but judgmental looks. Respect can't be bought, Dad. It's earned. And this is your downfall. Her daughter's words echoed louder than any speech, striking Alejandro like well-aimed blows. The tycoon tried to laugh, but his laugh sounded like a broken sob, drawing even more contempt from those present. The mask he'd worn for years was shattered, and there was no longer any way to hide it. Every attempt to assert himself only widened the chasm between him and the respect he so desperately sought. One of the older guests, who had remained silent until then, raised his voice. "Montalban, this night will be remembered not as your celebration, but as your disgrace. We all saw what you truly are, an arrogant tyrant who delights in humiliating others until he was unmasked by a man who never needed wealth to be great." The hall reacted with subdued applause. Alejandro felt his blood boil with rage, but he had no way to respond. What could he say? His words had lost their weight. The audience no longer belonged to him. He was like a dethroned king, left naked in the middle of the court that had once applauded him. Don Esteban, with a firm voice, broke the silence. "The laughter I received today was the same I heard at tables of power, when leaders believed the fate of millions was a joke. But I've learned that arrogance always falls. And today, Mr. Montalban, your fall is public and inevitable." The guests murmured among themselves, some with discreet smiles, others still shocked by the turnaround they were witnessing. No one there would ever look at Alejandro the same way again. His image of greatness was shattered, and everyone knew nothing could rebuild it. Lucia took a deep breath and took the old man's hand in a gesture of recognition. "Today, Don Esteban, you showed us that dignity doesn't need a stage. It shines even in the shadows, even in silence. And this light is stronger than any fortune." Her voice moved those present, who nodded in agreement. Alejandro, helpless, felt himself shrink before the judgmental gazes. The man he had always humiliated was now the one being humiliated, and in the hearts of each guest, the sentence had already been decreed. Alejandro Montalban was guilty of his own downfall. Don Esteban looked up at the hall and declared, "What you witness today is not the victory of one man over another, but the victory of truth over lies, of dignity over arrogance. May each of you take this lesson to heart, never again to remain silent in the face of injustice." The applause that followed was subdued but powerful, like muffled thunder on a stormy night. Alejandro stumbled back a step, as if pushed by the weight of the crushing gazes. His face was pale, sweat dripped down his forehead, and his eyes lost their arrogant gleam. He was the perfect image of a defeated man, laid bare before those who once feared him. The golden giant was now nothing more than a small man in ruins. Don Esteban, without raising his voice, said sharply, "You wanted to turn me into a spectacle, Señor Montalban. But tonight it was you who became a spectacle, and everyone here is a witness that no amount of wealth can erase the shame of arrogance." His words were met with reverent silence, as if they were a judge's final verdict. Lucia turned to her father, tears streaming down her face. "I've always admired you, but today I realize my admiration was based on fear and illusion. I'll never be able to look at you with pride again. Today, my heart turns to the truth this man brought, not the lie you represent." The impact of her words was devastating. The excited guests began to clap slowly, one by one, until the entire hall erupted in subdued applause. It wasn't celebratory applause, but rather applause of respect for Don Esteban's courage. Each clap was a brick torn from the wall of arrogance Alejandro had erected throughout his life. Alejandro tried to shout to drown out the applause, but his voice faltered. The once feared magnate was now nothing more than a powerless shadow. No one listened to him anymore. No one followed him anymore. The party had become his tribunal and his sentence. Don Esteban looked directly at him and said, "You thought you could buy laughter and applause, but respect is not for sale. And what we witnessed today will be etched in our memory forever. The downfall of a man who mistook wealth for greatness." The audience responded with even louder applause, some even standing. Lucia, her voice breaking, turned her back on her father. "If you ever want to win anything back from me, you'll have to learn to be human before you become rich. But I fear that, for you, it's already too late." Tears streamed down her face, but her posture was firm, marking the definitive break between father and daughter. The entire room was united in a single feeling: indignation at the tycoon's behavior and reverence for the elderly man's dignity. For the first time in decades, Alejandro felt absolute solitude. He was surrounded by people, but no one else was with him. Don Esteban took a deep breath and concluded, "The powerful believe that the silence of the humble is weakness, but they forget that one day this silence can become a voice. And when that happens, not even the tallest palaces can resist." The words echoed like the final hammer blows on the coffin of Alejandro's arrogance. The tycoon, head down, dropped the glass he was holding. The sound of the crystal shattering on the floor was the perfect symbol of his downfall. The party, once a stage for ostentation, was now a reflection of his downfall. And in the center of the room, in front of everyone, Alejandro Montalban was reduced to what he really was: a small man, devoid of respect, crushed by his own arrogance. Alejandro, staggering, still tried to maintain his composure. His gaze wandered among the guests, as if searching for an ally who could save him from impending ruin. But all he received were cold stares, some filled with contempt, others with indifference. The man who prided himself on controlling crowds was now alone, stripped of all the false grandeur he had displayed for years. Don Esteban walked slowly to the center of the room, each step resounding like a blow to the magnate's pride. The old man was in no hurry, knowing he didn't need to shout to win. The truth had already taken hold of the room, and every glance confirmed it. Alejandro trembled before a man who had nothing, yet possessed everything, the dignity he had never achieved. Lucia remained beside Don Esteban, her hand resting on his shoulder, reinforcing the contrast between the daughter who admired the truth and the father who drowned in lies. "Father, you always said that respect was our greatest asset, but today we see that you never had respect. Only fear, and the fear is gone." Her voice sounded firm, like a gavel sealing a sentence. Alejandro tried to react, pointing at Don Esteban. "He's nothing, a failed old man, a beggar who makes up stories to deceive us." But his voice was drowned out by the audience's disapproving murmurs. His every word was met not with fear, but with revulsion. There was no longer any power in his tongue, only despair. Don Esteban looked up and calmly replied, "A failure is he who has everything and leaves nothing but shame. I lived in silence because the truth I carried bothered. But you, Mr. Montalban, will live in the noise of laughter that will mock your downfall." The hall erupted in applause and murmurs of approval. The tycoon tried to stifle the scene by banging on the tables, but his strength was futile. The audience no longer followed him. On the contrary, each angry gesture only sank him deeper into the mire of humiliation. The king of the night was now the clown of his own tragedy, exposed without defense. Lucia turned her back on her father for the first time in front of everyone. The simple gesture was more devastating than any words. The tycoon, who had always believed himself untouchable, now felt his own daughter's rejection as the most painful wound of all. Don Esteban, looking around, raised his voice one last time. "Today you have seen that not even the richest can erase the dignity of the humblest. May this night serve as an eternal reminder that truth can be forgotten, but never destroyed." The applause this time was loud, steady, like thunder that shook the hall. Alejandro, his eyes brimming with tears, lowered his head. For the first time, he seemed to realize the scale of his own ruin. The man who built concrete empires was now reduced to dust before the sole elderly man who dared speak. The audience moved, no longer saw Don Esteban as a waiter, but as a figure greater than everyone present. And every glance cast at Alejandro was a reminder that his downfall was complete. The tycoon had nothing left. The luxurious party was over, and in its place remained only a silent courtroom. A courtroom that had condemned Alejandro Montalban not to prison, but to oblivion and eternal contempt. Alejandro tried to leave the room with hurried steps, but was stopped by the heavy silence that followed him. Each guest made room for him, not as an act of respect, but as a gesture of rejection. It was as if no one wanted to get dirty by touching him. The human corridor that formed was the perfect reflection of his defeat. Don Esteban watched without vanity, simply with serenity. He knew there was no need to celebrate Alejandro's downfall, because the magnate himself had already destroyed himself with his arrogance. The silence that fell over the room was proof that the lesson had been learned by all. Lucia wept softly, but her tears weren't just of sadness. They were also of liberation. For the first time, she felt she could breathe without carrying the weight of shame inherited from her father. Her decision to walk away was made, and she knew she would never again tread the same path he had chosen. Alejandro, feeling the weight of their gazes, tried to regain a shred of dignity. "You don't understand. I'm still Alejandro Montalban. This empire is mine, and without me you would be nothing." But his words echoed hollowly, like screams in a desert. No one responded. No one reacted. His voice was just a lost breath. Don Esteban then took a few steps toward the exit, passing the defeated tycoon. As he passed him, he paused for a moment and whispered just long enough for him to hear. "Greatness is not measured by what we build outwardly, but by what we leave within others. And in that, you have always been poor." Alejandro closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each syllable. The audience watched in absolute silence. It was as if everyone expected Alejandro to react. But there was nothing left of him but a broken man. His arrogance had evaporated, and in its place was only a weary body, carrying the shame of a lifetime. Lucia turned one last time to look at her father. "Farewell, father. Not as your daughter, but as a witness to your downfall. The name Montalban will never again carry the same weight, because tonight you made it synonymous with arrogance and defeat." Her words were the final seal on the sentence. Don Esteban walked toward the dining room doors. Each guest, upon seeing him pass, bowed discreetly in respect. The old waiter, once invisible, now departed like a moral giant, leaving behind a crowd marked by the most powerful lesson of their lives. Alejandro stood alone in the center of the empty hall, surrounded only by the shards of crystal from the goblet he had broken. The sound of silence was deafening, and in it echoed his ruin. For the first time, there was no one to laugh at his jokes or applaud his arrogance. Only emptiness remained. The tycoon, once the owner of everything, now owned nothing. And his greatest fortune, his pride, had been stripped away in front of everyone, replaced by eternal humiliation. This would be the memory he could never erase. The room was completely silent when Don Esteban reached the exit door. The old man paused for a moment and looked back, seeing Alejandro alone in the center of the room, defeated and small in the face of his own arrogance. There was no anger in his eyes, only silent compassion. It was the compassion of someone who knew that true victory lay not in destroying the enemy, but in proving that dignity always prevails. Lucia walked beside the elderly man, holding his hand as if choosing a new path. The guests made room, and some even approached to thank the old man with glances and discreet gestures. He had transformed a night of luxury into a timeless lesson, reminding everyone that greatness is not measured by gold, but by the truth we carry in our hearts. Alejandro remained motionless, listening to the doors close behind Don Esteban. The tycoon realized that his greatest defeat lay not only in the public humiliation, but in the fact that from that night on, his name would be remembered not for power, but for shame. And this memory would be eternal, like a scar on the soul. Don Esteban stepped out onto the cold Mexico City street, taking a deep breath as if releasing decades of silence. The night wind touched his face, and he walked serenely, knowing he no longer had to prove anything. The weight of humiliation had become a legacy, and the old man was finally regaining his voice before the world. The guests who remained inside the ballroom were still reflecting on what they had witnessed. Many would never humiliate anyone in the same way again. Others would forever carry the memory of that night as a turning point in their lives. The judgment had not been just on Alejandro, but on everyone who had ever been complicit in his arrogance. Lucia, overcome with emotion, declared in a firm voice before leaving, "May each person here take with them the truth we saw today, because dignity does not die and justice always finds a way." Her words echoed in the air, like a reminder impossible to erase. The old man's figure disappeared among the city lights, but his lesson remained alive in every heart. He needed no applause, because the greatest accolade was having transformed humiliation into hope. What began as cruelty ended as inspiration. And this is where the lesson comes home to you. How many times has the world tried to silence your voice or made you believe you were worthless? Don Esteban's story shows us that dignity always finds its right time to speak. No one can erase the truth you carry within. Never forget, those who humiliate others only reveal their own smallness. Those who resist with dignity transform even pain into victory. True greatness lies not in what you possess, but in what you leave in your mark on others. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Because here, every story brings a lesson, and every lesson can change lives. The story ends, but the message remains. Never allow your voice to be silenced. Because one day, like Don Esteban, you may discover that your truth has the power to transform the world.